We're fortunate today to have Linda Naeve speak to us about peonies and spring flowering bulbs. Linda has worked as a horticulturist at Iowa State for over 20 years. She's at Reiman Gardens, where she's the education coordinator, and she is a jack of all trades. She does an awful lot of writing and speaking, among a number of other things. Her broad base of knowledge equips her to speak on a wide range of topics. But today, she's going to speak to us about fall planting of spring blooming bulbs and peonies. So I'd like to welcome Linda to speak.
Now, am I live? Can you hear me okay? Good, because I've got a little mic on, because I dance around a little bit up here, so I'm using a little mic. Well, thank you, Melanie. And I was visiting with a few of you earlier who are here for Master Gardeners, and I have a soft spot in my heart for Master Gardeners in the Master Gardener program. So how many of you are Master Gardeners here today? Well, a few of you. Good, good. And if you need to know more about the Master Gardener program, I'm sure any one of those that raised their hand would be glad to share their information on Master Gardener program with you and all the fun things that Master Gardeners do. I'm from Reiman Gardens, and I've also asked Melanie if I can take the opportunity later to do a little advertising on Reiman Gardens too. But first of all, we're going to talk about planting bulbs and peonies. And I hope you all take away with you something new. Now, many of you may be avid gardeners now, but maybe say, well, it's like reading a newspaper article. If I can get one point or one new idea, it's worth my time to come. So I appreciate you all coming and taking your afternoon to come up with that one new point or idea. Let's talk a little bit about peonies first. On the back table, I have a little outline, so you don't have to take a lot of notes, because usually they darken the room, so I can't see if you're falling asleep. But anyway, there's a little handout, one on peonies, one on fall bulbs, that my program today follows this outline. A lot of the things that I have written on the slides are also on the handouts. A little bit about peonies. Peonies belong to the genus Paeonia, which is a member of the Ranunculaceae family. Well, that may not mean much to you, but if you're a gardener and grow buttercups, it's the buttercup family. So the ranunculus family has a lot of individuals in it that are spring bloomers or are herbaceous. They come up early and sort of die down, and peonies being one of them, especially our garden herbaceous peony. I'm going to be talking about 3 species of peonies today. There are hybrids off of these. There are Japanese hybrids. To me, that was going into a little more detail than I really think we needed at this point. So I'm going to talk about the differences and the similarities in the way we grow each one of these. The Peony lactiflora is also sometimes known as Peony officinalis. It kind of goes back and forth depending on the botanist you're talking to. This is our common herbaceous peony. The common herbaceous peony is the one that grows about 3 to 4 feet tall, comes up as little red shoots in the spring, dies down completely to the ground. That's the one we see most often, and that have been around for years and years. The Peony tenuifolia is the fern leaf peony. This particular peony is also a herbaceous species. It comes up in the spring, dies down in the fall. Now, the Peonies fruticosa is the tree peony. The tree peony is grafted on woody stock, and it does not die down to the ground in the fall, and you do not prune it back to the ground in the fall, or you'll be planting a new one the next spring. So there's the differences right there. All are hardy for central Iowa. There's none any more hardy than the other. There are some that are more temperamental than others. The fernleaf peony, you'll say, why does that cost so much more when you go to buy it? And the tree peonies, because they don't propagate as easily. They don't send up all those multiple shoots as do the common peony to make division easy. So the fernleaf peony is so expensive because it is more difficult to propagate. Talk a little bit about where peonies came from. Peonies are one of the oldest cultivated plants for their flowers known to man. The Chinese were growing peonies clear back 1,400 to 4,000 years ago. Matter of fact, peonies is really one of their national flowers in China. Years later, it was introduced to Japan, and the Japanese then took the peony and did numerous hybridizations with it. So much of the peonies that we get today come from Japan. many of the hybrids, the tree peonies. So if you go to the garden center or look in catalogs, you'll see that many of the cultivar names for the hybrid peonies are Japanese names, particularly the tree peonies. Peonies are classified according to their flower form, not just the type, but within amongst themselves we have different flower forms. The singles, the semi-doubles, the doubles, and the Japanese. With the tree peony and the herbaceous peony, the common peony, both those types will have these different flower forms. So if you say, well, a tree peony is always a single, that's not true because there are double forms of the tree peonies. Maybe you just never see them, but they're out there. We'll talk a little bit about each one of those, and I have them written down here a little bit, and we'll go back through each one of these. The single peony has just one or more rows of petals, and they surround stamen-bearing stamens, or pollen-bearing stamens. That last statement, pollen-bearing stamens, is important because they will form a seed head. They are pollinated because some of our others are not. The singles are beautiful when they're open. They're not quite as heavy on the plants as the doubles are. They come in all colors as well. The semi-doubles tend to have a second row of broad petals, again around some pollen-bearing stamens. And then there are the double flowering, which consists of several broad petals and no stamens inside, no small stamens inside. Where the Japanese peony have pollenless staminoids, it's called, rather than stamens. So the Japanese are extremely attractive because of their large staminoids rather than small stamens. That's what makes them so outstanding, because the yellow inside is so intense. But we do have both double and single forms of the Japanese as well. But we have this distinct center. Going back and on the handout, I've talked about some of the characteristics of the herbaceous versus the tree peonies. And Melanie said when she asked me to come that I really talk a lot about the differences in that and take away some of the myths that are associated or the aura surrounding the tree peony. Herbaceous perennials are succulent. They come up every year and die back to the ground. The real problem we have with these is that the new shoots come up so early in the spring. They're dark. It's easy to step on them in the garden. It's easy to mow over them. My dad used to do that to my mother all the time. I remember that. It's my first experience with peonies, is hearing my mother say, "You mowed them off again." So that happens. So they also range in colors from shades of pink to deep crimson red and various shades in between. Now the tree peonies have a rough, coarse bark. They'll grow up to 5 or 6 feet tall. And instead of dying back to the ground every year, they form sort of a bush. They're not a tree. To me, a tree is a single stem that has all the branches on top, where the tree peony is woody stems that come off more like a shrub with multiple branches. Now, you can find some tree peonies that have been pruned in the nursery to look more like a standard tree. But typically, a tree peony will have branches on it. They come in shades, the same shades as your standard herbaceous peony, but we can also add purple, yellow, green, and maroon to that. So there's just a lot larger selection in color. Now we get a lot of tree peonies on the market that are yellow now because of hybridization. They cross it with a peony that you'll see in a little bit called a lutea. I think I might have. There's the fernleaf peony. Notice its foliage is so much more different than the others, and it's much shorter, only goes 2 to 3 feet tall. Beautiful, beautiful plant. The fernleaf peony blooms earlier than the herbaceous peony and the tree peony. And the tree peony also has a real broad foliage, bold, bold yellow colors in yellows. And again, many times the tree peony will have the yellow petals, and around the stamens it's a little bit red, and that brings out the characteristics from the lutea species of peony that is one of its parent lines. And you can see that right here, all these, if I can get my little arrow there, all these nice little red, almost looks like little blood veins coming out of the center part of the flower. Beautiful. The tree peony's blooms are much larger if you can imagine that, if you've never seen one. They're larger than that on a standard peony. Not quite like that. Maybe more like that. I saw somebody in the back going, whoa. Not like the disco bell hibiscus. No, more smaller than that. But still, quite a bit larger. And they do bloom earlier than your common peonies as well. What do peonies need to grow? Well, the really exciting thing about peonies is they're hardy for our area. They just need sun. I've seen them growing in shade, and they tend to be very leggy. The bloom size is small, and even worse yet, the stems are very small. So if the blooms are nice, the first little bit of rain, they're flat on the ground. So sun is very important to get your nice, strong stems and nice, healthy plants. Plus, the sun is important to keep your diseases to a minimum, as well as keep the plant healthy. They do prefer a well-drained, loamy soil. Don't plant them in a poorly drained area. You're going to get botrytis. I'll show you examples of that in a little bit. They're going to just rot and die out. The neat thing about peonies is they can tolerate a soil pH of about neutral, even a little bit higher in some of our Iowa soils. If we get up to 7.5, you're still doing fine with peonies. So they're very forgiving when it comes to soil pH. Now, if you lived in an area where your pH was maybe 5 or 5.5, then you would have to amend the soil. You'll run into problems. But here in Iowa, we're pretty lucky about that. Peonies are two plants that I would consider heirloom plants. Peonies being one, and I'll talk about what I mean by heirloom plants, and Christmas cactus. Can you understand those two characteristics those two plants might have? They live forever, unless somebody inherits it and kills it. But overall, they're a wonderful plant to pass down. You find them on Grandma's farm, or Grandma had a Christmas cactus and it was passed down to Mom, and now it's part of yours. They propagate easily. The peonies are the same way. You may find on your grandma's homestead a peony that maybe they planted 75 years ago and it's still there. They live a very long time. So that brings me, how often should I divide a peony? We talk about Shasta daisies, mums, purple coneflowers, these plants that need to be divided every 3 to 4 years, iris. But how often does peonies need divided? About every 50 years. So, moral of the story is when Grandma's ready to give up her peony, you can divide it at that time. They don't need and they do not like to be divided. I'll relate a story to you on peonies. When the Reiman Gardens first opened, when we were moving plants from our old horticulture gardens at Iowa State, those peonies were there since 1962, and we moved them 40 years. They had never been dug or divided except one, and I'll talk about that in a minute too. Never been moved, never been divided. And when we went out there with the students, of course, you know, those of you here from Iowa City understand this too, students are really good workers when they demand a grade. So we use our students in our class laboratory, so it was a very good learning experience for them. So we took them out to the garden, shovel in hand, said, okay, now we're going to dig our rare peony collection and move it to the Reiman Gardens. Oh, okay. They were all excited until they saw the base of those peony plants were the size of large tree trunks. They were absolutely huge. It took 4 shovels around each peony because they've got an extremely long taproot to dig down, and then we took garden forks and lifted each one out. So each one was bigger than the size of this table that we took back down to the garden. They were absolutely huge. We did not do any dividing off of them. I mean, we could have, but we did not. So, moral of the story is you really don't need to divide it very often. However, you have a clump that's growing near a tree or other perennials that have started to encroach this area and crowding it out, and you do need to dig and divide it, the fall is the best time to do it. Early fall. From now, probably you've got about a 3-week window to go on and divide it, dig and divide. The rule of thumb is, and so why do we say fall for peonies? A good rule of thumb is for perennials, if they bloom in the spring, you divide in the fall. So if we think back on that, they bloom in the spring, bleeding hearts, peonies, iris, they are all best divided and dug and separated and replanted in the fall. Now, there are some exceptions. I mean, hostas, you can dig and divide hostas about any time. Daylilies, just about any time. Mums, the spring, you wouldn't want to be digging and dividing them now because they're blooming right now. So It's just opposite their season of bloom is when you dig and divide. So if you can't quite remember that concept, just think of when they bloom. As I mentioned with our peonies, I want to back up just 1 minute and talk about why it's so important to do this in the fall because of the life of the peony. At our old horticulture gardens, we had peonies lining our sunken gardens. And we had one peony that was a lutea, which is a species peony, very rare, that again was the primary parent line for many of our tree peonies. Someone came one night and decided they wanted us to share that with them. And they were smart enough to know which one out of bloom was our lutea, but they weren't smart enough to know that when you dig it in July, that's not really a good time. It's too hot. So they took a chunk out of our lutea right in the middle of the heat of the summer. So we never did find out who it was, but and ours did survive, but it didn't bloom for about 2 or 3 years. But yeah, they came in. So now, if you come to Reiman Gardens, we sort of have a fence around our garden. There are reasons for that. When you're digging peonies, the idea is don't go in and dig a chunk out like that individual did. When you're digging and dividing peonies, you want to raise the entire clump. Raise the entire clump. Dig it up, because if you're going to replant it again, you can lay it down. It's probably good for it to put it back in rather than just dig a chunk out of it. Dig the entire clump and wash it off, because this time of the year, this is what your peony division is going to look like. You're going to have a real strong taproot, so you want to go down deep. And you're going to have these bright pink eyes or buds on this tuber of the peony. Wash it off, because you want to see where those eyes are, because each division that you take from that peony clump should have no less than 3 and ideally 5 of those eyes. If you cut it apart and you have a division that has 3 eyes or less, it may take 3 or more years for that peony to bloom. But if you have a good 5 eyes on that, that's a good healthy division, and likelihood of it reblooming quickly for you is pretty high. So you want 3 to 5 eyes or buds on that tuber. You want to dig a hole that's much deeper than what that peony is going to require. 12 to 18 inches and about 12 inches wide. So it's almost like you're planting a tree. Why? Because what you're going to do is then go back and take some of your backfill soil, make a cone in the center of that planting hole, take your roots and spread them over that cone, and then fill them in. But the key to that is you want to make sure that when you put them back over, and I think I have a picture of it. No, backing up. There we go. When you put them back, put the soil back over, you want those eyes about 1 inch below the soil surface. One of the primary reasons peonies fail to bloom for gardeners is the fact that they are planted too deep. Too deeply. So you can see this. You've got that very strong tuber down here, the eyes facing up, of course. Now, if you laid it on their side, eventually they'll find their way up, and new eyes will form on that. It shouldn't be a problem, but they're better off going straight up. It's like putting the tulip bulb on its side. It will find its way up, but it's going to take a little while. So 1 inch, not 2 inches, definitely not 3 inches, or you won't have bloom on that peony. They're extremely hardy. You don't have to worry about the ground. You just don't want to have them exposed to the surface like you could an iris rhizome. Let's talk a little bit about when that peony emerges next spring. I told you about my situation. It could easily get broken or mowed off. But when the foliage is 3 inches tall in the spring, that's early spring. Now's the time to fertilize your peony bush. And you say, why? I've never fertilized it before. By fertilizing, it increases the vigor of the plant. It'll increase the strength of the stems. It'll increase the vigor in the foliage to withstand disease attack. Just good overall program where you go with a 5-10-5, just a simple complete analysis fertilizer, and about 1/4 of a cup around each plant. Now, garden books will tell you, put about 2 pounds per 100 square feet. Well, you think 2 pounds per 100 square feet. Let me see, I've got 3 peony bushes. How does that translate down per 100 square feet? You know, it always bothers me. I think if ever I write a garden book, I'm always going to bring it down to the plant side, you know. How much per plant? A handful, 1/4 of a cup. Around each plant, make sure you don't get it on the foliage. Water it in well, because you don't want it on the foliage or it'll burn. But you'll find your peonies do much better. Even if they've sat on Grandma's farm and bloomed reliably every year for 50 years, I think a good fertilizer will help it. Another thing to remember is whenever the peonies are in full bloom, then we get 2 inches of rain. And the peonies are flat on the ground. So just about the time that they're emerging, either get a specialty peony ring that you can buy at garden centers and in the garden supply catalogs, those dream catalogs, you know, we get this time of year that have, and in the spring that have all those neat tools and gadgets for gardens. Well, they do have peony rings too that are very flexible. They have 4 legs on them and just a ring. Or you can use one of the small tomato cages. But put them up when the peony is just coming up out of the ground, and you'll find they'll grow into that very nicely. Now, not every stem will go in the cage, but it does camouflage that cage pretty well, and you won't see it, but you'll know it's there when that heavy rain comes and your heavy double white peonies are blooming. They'll stay nice and upright. Mulching is important with peonies, particularly those that you have just planted this fall. And peonies, as I mentioned, are quite winter hardy. The only problem we have, especially in new loose soil, where we dug a nice big hole, put lots of new loose soil in, watered it well, it's going to freeze and thaw. That soil in the wintertime is going to freeze and thaw, which then heaves that little plant out of the ground. And remember, that eye is just an inch below. So if we mulch over it, it not only delays the freezing, it prevents that alternate freezing and thawing action that will then bring our eyes a little high. The same thing goes with chrysanthemums that you're planting this time of year. Ordinarily, you would say if you're planting mums this time of year, treat them as annuals. But that's not, you don't have to. If you go in later in the season, put a good layer of mulch down over them, don't cut the foliage back, your mums will be fine too, because the foliage will help hold snow in. The reason we lose mums in the winter is we don't have enough snow cover as an insulation, and we get too much freezing and thawing on the crown of that plant. So it's off on a different tangent, but it's the same principle. Remove the seed heads after flowering. They're ugly. You don't want them on there. And besides that, they do drain the plants of its energies. That little bit of seed head production will take a lot of energy from your plant, and you want it to be producing new shoots so you have a larger plant the following year. In the fall, cut back the stems down all the way to the ground. Don't wait till spring to do this. It's important that you do it in the fall. And once they die down in November, when you're starting to clean up your garden, leave your mums up, take your peonies down. The reason we do this is there are leaf spot diseases, botrytis, and other things that overwinter on that dead foliage. And by the time you would get to it in the spring, your new foliage is probably up an inch or 2. You run the risk of damaging that by removing the old foliage. Plus, already the old foliage that has diseases on it is going to re-inoculate your new leaves that are just emerging. Get it completely out of the garden in the fall, and that helps sanitize your garden and reduces the incidence of diseases in the future. But if you decide you're growing tree peonies, again, don't cut those back, or you won't see those again, because they will not rebud up from the ground. Some of the diseases we run into, this is a good example of one called botrytis. This is a disease that we run into in extremely wet springs, in wet soils, and in areas that aren't well ventilated. In other words, they're crowded together. What it is, it's a stem rot. And many of you may have seen this in your peonies at one time or another, where the shoots at the stems, when they're nearly full grown or after, will start dying off little by little. What do you do about it? Well, you dig your peonies, replant them in a better drained area, remove all the dead and diseased foliage. There isn't much you can do ordinarily to control this, and then plant them in another area if they're not too far gone. but botrytis is a serious problem. Another problem we run into is just ordinary leaf spot. You've probably seen that. They start out as small lesions on the leaves. This fungal disease then spreads to be big black splotches on your foliage. It's not something that's going to knock your plant quite the way botrytis does, but it makes it unsightly. Again, the best cure for that is good sanitation in the fall. Remove all of your dead leaves out of the garden in the fall. So leaf spot and botrytis, those are our two major menaces of peonies. Now we come to the story of ants. How many of you have been waiting for this? Get this question all the time in the spring. Those black ants. I don't have black ants on my peonies and they're not going to bloom because I've been told those black ants bite the buds open and that makes the peonies bloom. You laugh. I hear every spring we get that. And you know, it does make sense because even again as a child, what do you remember in the peonies? You don't remember their beautiful bloom, but you remember those big black carpenter ants. There is a little relationship between them. The black ants are there for the sweetness. If you ever notice peony buds are fairly sticky, well, the ants are there to feed on the sticky honeydew that's on the buds. They like that. They do nothing for the peony, so it's a one-way relationship there. The peony is giving them the sap. The ants then give nothing back to the peony. They just live there. They don't chew on the leaves. They don't chew on anything. They don't cause any problems. They just are a nuisance, basically, especially when you cut them and bring them in the house. So, but they don't have anything to do with it. Another question we often get is why peonies fail to bloom. I have this peony somebody gave me, and it's not blooming. I've had it for 3 or 4 years. Well, as you can see, the list is quite long of the kind of questions that we have to ask in order to maybe pinpoint the reason. Peonies, the number one reason they do not bloom is they've been planted too deeply. So if you've had a peony in the ground for 3 or 4 years, redig it, and it has never bloomed, redig it, set it up a little bit higher, and I think you'll be more successful with it. Immature plants, if it didn't have many eyes on it when you planted it, or if it weren't in good shape, it was really young that you bought at the garden center or the nursery, you didn't get a high quality plant, and it's just sort of hanging on, it's not going to bloom for you very well either. So it has to get some maturity under it. Typically, 2 years to 3 years is not unusual for it to take a peony to bloom, unless you've just dug a plant and replanted it. But if you've divided it, it might take 2 or 3 years before it really starts blooming nicely. If you have your peony in your lawn, or right in the edge of your garden, where you're constantly fertilizing your yard with heavy nitrogen, excess nitrogen will cause your peonies to fail to bloom, or the buds may not form very, very well, or the buds may be very small. So excess nitrogen. What do you do about that? That's pretty easy. You just stop fertilizing then. You can really soak the soil with water if it's a well-drained site to try to leach a little of that nitrogen out. But overall, that's probably 3rd or 4th on the list of the problems. Inadequate sunlight. They're one of those herbaceous plants that requires 6 hours of sun. If you don't give that, it won't give you the bloom you want. Overcrowding. If you have a whole row of peonies that have been there a while, or maybe you planted them a little close and they start crowding each other, that's a good indicator that they're crowded is the fact that they're not blooming well. Or if you have trees nearby, large trees that are competing for nutrients and water. Peonies are not real good competitors with trees, so that should be kept in mind too. So all of these things all play a factor in why a peony won't bloom for you. It has nothing to do that you don't have the black ants. Before we go on to bulbs, do you have any questions on peonies? Yes?
I had read that you weren't supposed to use any manure or compost or anything like that, and I don't usually use the commercial fertilizers.
Mhm.
The concern was the botrytis. So I was wondering if you had any comments, yay or nay on that.
I have not heard that. I would say if you have access to good, rich, well-decomposed manure, that would be my first choice. Compost would be my second choice, and the reason I have it in that order is if there were some diseases in the compost that didn't get fully eliminated with the heat, then you're reintroducing it to your garden. But overall, I would say those two are the best things to ensure good drainage and nutrient retention. So if you're an organic gardener, Yes, by all means.
Put them on both fall and spring then?
Yes, yes. Yeah. Okay. Okay, what you might want to do then is, if you have any questions on peonies, write it down, and we'll take them after our cookie break. Now we're going to go into fall planting bulbs, because there's a lot more bulbs than there are types than there are peony types to talk about. Nothing is more invigorating in the spring than bulbs. I mean, after a drab winter, it's just like turning on color TV or seeing color pictures after black and white. And I do have a handout on bulbs. I didn't bring mine up here. Okay, fall planted bulbs, and on the other side of the handout is a little table that talks about the species that I will discuss, the height those get in your garden, because this is important. When we're planting spring flowering bulbs, it's not like we're putting out herbaceous perennials where we kind of know what their height is. The bulbs are underground, and we have to know, are they going to go 30 inches tall, because you want the taller ones in back and the shorter ones in the front. And those little bulbs, you can't really judge by that unless you know. The distance between bulbs, because you never plant one soldier. The number of bulbs per square foot. When you are ordering or buying bulbs, it's kind of like going to the grocery store when you're hungry this time of year. And sometimes you go and you either overshop or you undershop. And then you try to go back and say, well, I think I bought golden apple dorns, but I'm not sure. Those are yellow ones. They sort of look like it, but they may not be the same at all. And you end up with something you didn't want. So this will help you estimate how many bulbs you're going to need. And then the season of bloom. So that's on the back. So as I talk my way through this, you'll see that that chart is there to help you. We're going to talk about tulips. Tulips are a wonderful crop to grow for many reasons. There's a color that they provide. They're relatively inexpensive for the amount of show you get. There's a wide variety of colors, wide varieties of flower forms, reasons you don't, and plus the foliage does die down rather quickly as compared to daffodils. I love daffodils, but that dang foliage is there until the end of June sometimes. For 2 weeks of show, you're putting up with the foliage for several more weeks after that. With tulips, they know enough to die back down within a few weeks. Then you can easily remove the foliage. So that's the advantages. Now the disadvantages of tulips, one is they never last quite long enough. And that's a personal thing. They last as long as they're going to last unless a strong wind comes along. But you just want them to last longer in the spring. And secondly, the problem is they are gourmet food for deer and rabbits, where daffodils are not. So you kind of got to weigh it back and forth. But if there's a daffodil, or if there's a tulip anywhere to be around, the deer will find it. Botanical tulips are the early blooming tulips, and we often hear them called the botanicals, and why I don't know. But these are the tulips that your grandmother planted, that you swear come back year after year after year, and the ones that you plant 2 years ago, you don't get anything out of, because you are planting the hybrids, and she planted the botanicals. The Greigi, the Kaufmanniana, and the Fosteriana are our botanicals that come back year after year reliably and oftentimes multiply. The Greigi typically bloom rather short, 8 to 10 inches tall, early in the spring, and they have the striped or mottled foliage. That's the indicator. They're typically red. They don't come in a wide assortment of colors, maybe yellows, but not a real selection. You can't get pinks and whites and yellows and things like that. Or pinks and whites and red, burgundies and all the colors that some of the hybrids offer. The Kaufmanniana are called the water lily tulips. They have a very short stem, and they open during the day and look just like a bright red water lily because the petals reflex out. Then in the evening, they close back up. Next morning, they're wide open again. They're wonderful plants, and they have mottled foliage. They're great for the front of a border, and they do multiply. Not aggressively like a Scilla or a Muscari, but they will multiply in their bulbs, and they come back reliably. The Fosterianas are probably the big tall tulips that you remember your grandmother had that keep coming back as one clump every year. 12 to 18 inches tall stems, very strong. And the Emperor series that have been around for years and years and years are Fritillaria tulips. Another early tulip is a species tulip, and I might have a picture of that later on, called the Tulipa tarda, which is not what was classified as botanical, but it's a species tulip that blooms yellow. And it multiplies, sets seeds, and the seeds do germinate, and you get lots of little Tulipa tardas growing. Tulip growers will classify in their catalogs by early, mid-season, and late. And I always found this rather interesting because early is so variable. Early in Iowa could be February to the 1st of May, depending on the season. And early and somewhere in Oklahoma could be something different. So I just found that very interesting, the way they always classify it: early, mid-season, and late season. The early season tulips are our botanicals, are what we call our single earlies, and our double earlies. And so what do I mean by that? I gave you another handout called Tulip Classification. And our single earlies are the hybrids and cultivars that are derived from two other species type tulips. And they only grow 12 to 14 inches tall. You think, well, that seems pretty tall, but not compared to some of the large late season hybrids. And they flower in April, early May. These are the tulips that are likely to come up early and get hit with the first snow. That is one of the reasons that I really don't like to grow them, because inevitably you start seeing them come up, the foliage is up beautiful, and then we get the first snow, or a late snow in late March or April. The double earlies, and we'll talk about doubles in a little bit, they're similar to the same, but they just bloom early on shorter stems. The mid-season tulips are the Mendels, the Triumphs. The Triumphs are some of the best tulips you can find, and the Darwin hybrids. They're strong, they're sturdy, they're reliable. The foliage is attractive, the way it comes up and sort of cups around the stems, very pretty. The Darwins are actually a cross between the Fritillaria, the Darwin hybrids, and a Darwin, the old Darwins. These are the kind that you see often for sale. These are the varieties that you often see used as cut flowers. And these are the mid-season flowering tulips. So, if people ask my personal choice, what do I buy? I buy the Darwin hybrids and the Triumphs exclusively. I've tried some of these late flowering ones, and I'll go through and show you pictures of these. They're wonderful. They're beautiful. They're a little more temperamental. The lily flowering tulips, like some of the others, will beautiful the first year or two and then gradually fade away. Cottage tulips, the cottage tulips grow about 30 inches tall. They have that distinct, very egg shape rather than the boxy shape of the Darwins. The Rembrandts, I'll show you examples of those. They have the streaks of green. The parrot tulips are those huge, huge tulips that have fluffy parrot-like feathers, colors, and fluffy edges on the petals. Not fringed, but just fluffy. The fringe tulips are definitely look like somebody's taken scissors and cut little edges right in the tulips, and I'll show you an example of that. And then the late doubles, double lates. Beautiful, almost peony flowered tulips, and that's what they're often called. Backing up and looking at some of these that I've mentioned, this is the species tulip called Tulipa tarda. Highly recommend it. It is very early in the season, and it's probably one of the longest lasting tulips in your garden. It will bloom for 2 weeks in your garden. It opens during the day, closes at night, brilliant yellow with little white margins on the edges of the petals. You plant them in, you'll usually see them for sale in lots of 20 or 25 because you plant a drift of them. 1 or 2 isn't going to make it because they're only this tall. But if you look out on your garden, at the front of your garden, these will be blooming about the time your daffodils are. Beautiful contrast. And they will set a seed head. Don't cut those off because you're going to be out there with your little scissors or shears because there's so many of them. They will seed and sprout. In a few years, those little seedlings will be blooming. They won't crowd each other out. I've never seen that happen, but they do sort of spread and start the drift getting a little bit larger, but not real aggressively, not like Scilla. Now my husband cusses my Scylla because what's happened to it, it jumps out of the bed if you let it self-seed, and I get it coming up in my lawn, or in his lawn. It's my garden, it's his lawn. Got to get that clear. This is Esther, which is a mid-early variety. It's a Darwin type. Notice its boxy shape. That's very characteristic of a Darwin. This is probably, if you're into pinks like I am, this would be a good choice for you. Very strong stems, very upright growth, very uniform in height. This is the fringe tulip, a late blooming tulip. It's wonderful. It's very beautiful, very unusual. Definitely wouldn't pay the extra money for it if you're going to plant it in a bed that's going to be viewed from a distance, because the fringe does not show in a distance. But if you're going to put them and force them into bloom in pots, or plant them near your sidewalk, or bring them in as cut flowers, they're beautiful, beautiful tulips. But they're a little more expensive because of this fringe nature. And sometimes they have multiple blooms on one stem. This is the double late tulip called Angelique. It's a light pink. And if you had a vase of these, you'd be very hard-pressed from a distance to tell whether they're tulips or peonies. So they're often called peony flowering tulips. They're beautiful, absolutely beautiful. Very strong heads, strong stems, very large plants, 24 inches tall. They're real beautiful. This is the lily flowering tulip. A little bit smaller, but has a very characteristic lily shape where the petals are pointed at the end and sort of reflex out. Beautiful plants. They come in shades of red, pinks, whites, combinations thereof. They're beautiful the first year again, and eventually they sort of die out like many of our hybrid tulips do. These are the Rembrandts. The Rembrandts are sometimes called broken tulips, meaning the color has been broken. They've taken the virus out of them, but it used to be that back in the 1600s and before, when they were having wars over tulips, the broken tulips, those that showed variation in color like this, sold for extremely high prices. Houses, farms for a tulip bulb. But what they didn't realize is the reason they had that broken appearance is they were virused. And what do viruses do? They kill plants. And those tulip bulbs that were virused didn't live very long. So those people made very poor investments in tulip bulbs. But the Rembrandt tulips now have that broken look but no virus. Very, very beautiful in a vase, in an assortment. We'll come back and talk about planting tulips after we go through some of the species. Daffodils, wonderful plants in a garden. Early growth, early color, good in combination with other things. Deer tend to leave it alone. Rabbits tend to leave them alone. So overall, they're pretty darn good when it comes to that compared to others. But like I said, the foliage stays forever. When you're looking in catalogs, you'll see two things always mentioned when describing daffodils. It's trumpet and it's perianth. Now, the trumpet is often yellow, often pink, often white, often a little bit of everything. It's even curly, orange. So daffodils aren't just yellow. Those King Alfred daffodils, wonderful daffodils, but there's so many others out there on the market. Just going to show you a few of those that are available today. One is called Curly Large Cup, huge daffodil bloom, white with the curly yellow cup, almost orange cup, I should say. The Dutch Master is your common yellow daffodil that you would see for sale in early spring as a cut flower. It's great for naturalizing. It's probably one of the best varieties for naturalizing, the Dutch Master. King Alfred Improved is probably the second best for naturalizing. These are the ones the catalogs and the garden centers will offer by the bushels. If you're naturalizing, in my opinion, stick with one species, one cultivar, one variety. Don't start mixing all of these together. That's not natural. You've seen those commercials? That's not natural. Well, this is not natural when you do that. But because when things establish themselves in nature, it's often off of the same mother plant or similar species. You don't get all these oddballs in the same area. It's usually the same thing. So if you're going to naturalize with a variety, naturalize with all the same kind. These are a couple other strange ones, but very attractive ones when it comes to flower arranging with them or cutting them, bringing them indoors. Orangery. Notice it doesn't really have a single trumpet. There are more petals on the inside and the outside. And I've seen these also, the same style as the orangery here, with yellow petals on the inside. Poets, called Poets Jonquil, has the very white petals or perianth and then a nice little itty-bitty trumpet. So again, you'll see when you're exhibiting daffodils also, you'll find that they classify, the Daffodil Society classifies daffodils on the size of their trumpets. Then we have miniature daffodils. Miniature daffodils are sometimes called jonquils, but not all miniatures are jonquils. But all daffodils are narcissus. Okay, so is that complicated or what? So, moral of the story is a daffodil is a narcissus, but a daffodil and a jonquil are not the same thing. Jonquils tend to have the very large trumpets, tend to be rather small and more native looking than the very large King Alfred Dutch Master daffodils. So that's the difference between a jonquil. But a lot of people use the word interchangeably. But narcissus and daffodil are used interchangeably. We also have the doubles daffodils. Very pretty. The stems tend to be fairly short. I think that's the major fault I have seen with them. Instead of being on nice tall stems, they seem to come up on real little short squatty stems. Not real good for cut flowers. But they're beautiful. And again, they come in whites, beautiful whites that don't even look like daffodils. And they come in yellows, a little bit of orange, like this Tahiti double. Oh, I'm going to back up just real quick and talk a little bit about daffodils and their foliage again before I go on to hyacinths. Daffodil foliage will linger for a long time. Now, there are a couple ways that you can, if you have perennials around them and you have a little bit of time on your hands, you can do a couple things with them. And gardeners said, oh, you're kidding, you can't do that. Well, one thing is if you don't want it to stand up and come out of all your perennial foliage, take each plant or group of them, bend it over, and tie a rubber band around it. Now, that rubber band is going to age, and it's going to fall apart eventually. It's not going to be there forever. And by tipping that foliage over, bending it, it still is viable, still is taking in nutrients into that bulb, but yet it's not as obvious. Now, if you have a lot of time on your hands, I've seen some gardeners, I've even tried this just for fun to see if it works, is braid the foliage down. Braid it down, and you don't really see it. And it works great, especially if you have like hostas and other things coming up around it. But it does take a lot of time. But it sure makes it convenient when you're coming to pull that foliage when it does die down. All you have to do is take a hold of that braid and it comes right off. Very important, no matter what spring flowering bulbs you're growing, tulips, hyacinths, daffodils, that you allow that foliage to die down in the fall, or die down in the summer, naturally. Don't go out and cut it off prematurely, because your bulb size is going to grow according to how much food reserves it gathers from those leaves after bloom time. Go out and remove the spent blooms because they're a drain on the energy and they look unsightly, but let that foliage do its thing. And you can always tell when it's ready to come off. Rather than cutting off, you can give it a little twist. For example, if you let your tulip bulb die down completely dry to the point of being brown, you can go out there and just take a twist and each one of those stems will come right off. They just separate from the bulb underneath. Now, if you go to yank on it and you feel the bulb coming, that's not a good sign because it's still too green. I've done that with tulips or daffodils, thinking they've got to be ready pretty soon. You yank it, oh, well, there's the bulb. No, you don't want to do that. So very important to let it die down. But by banding off your daffodil foliage, it does hide them quite a bit, and it works pretty good when it comes to cleanup time, too. This is the hyacinth. It's one of those bulbs, or the Latin name is used as its common name. They're beautiful. These are one of those flowers that look so perfect, they look artificial, or else we've seen artificial ones that look so real because the real ones look so perfect. Kind of interesting how that works. They're beautiful. They do come back year after year, very faithfully come back. If you let that foliage die down, if you pretty much ignore them after they bloom, they'll come back faithfully year after year. And oftentimes they'll even come back and produce more than one. Like this is a clump that was naturalized sort of in an area around somebody's rock garden. And it looks very much like it was supposed to be there. As artificial as these plants look, they look like they really need to be there. They've left them alone year after year. And now instead of getting a single spike coming up, they've got multiple spikes coming up in that one area. So it looks a lot more natural. The colors that they come in, the blues, as brilliant a blue, almost a waxy blue, a Delft blue. There's a variety called Delft blue. White, pinks, fuchsia pink, and yellow. Beautiful, beautiful plants. Then there's the grape hyacinth. It's not even related to the last hyacinth we saw. This is a Muscari. Muscari, we have various forms of Muscari, but this one is called grape hyacinth because it's a spike like the hyacinth, but each of the little blossoms look a little bit like a grape. They're not almost brown berry shaped. To me, they look more like a blueberry flower. If you've ever seen a white blueberry flower, they're round like this too. Beautiful plants. If you've never grown them, you find that they do spread, but they come up perfectly every spring, very reliably. The catalogs now have some very unusual ones out. They come in white, just like this, but white. That's attractive, and it's a pure white. But they also have some, I like to call them mutants because they're odd. They're blue on the bottom, white on top, or they're combinations thereof. Totally different if you're in for the novelty, and I don't know how well they survive from year to year to year, but you might want to try them just for something different. I like the Muscari because it offers a true blue in the garden. Beautiful color. You'll find they do some rather unusual things when you grow them. They're coming up right now in your garden. In our flower garden, my husband says, I think you've got a new weed coming up. So he shows me, and I says, no, that's just the grape hyacinths coming up in the fall. Then they get a little winter burn, the foliage does in the winter. You just leave it, it'll do its thing, it'll send up a little bit of new foliage in the spring, but then right through it all comes these beautiful blue flowers. Newly planted Muscari will do the same thing sometimes. If we have a late fall, they'll send up their foliage in the fall, which is strange, but they won't bloom in the fall. Just send up their foliage to let you know that that's where they are, I think. Crocus. Rabbits will feed on Muscari foliage, but they don't feed on the blooms. So if they eat the foliage a little bit in the spring, the blooms will come right up through it. It's not like a tulip where they'll eat the buds too. The rabbits will, but the blooms will come right up through. Now crocus, on the other hand, the rabbits will eat everything. Everything that they can see. So that's a problem with crocus as well. They have real tiny, thin, grass blade-like leaves that are variegated with a little stripe down the center. They bloom earlier than you can imagine. Plant them in several hundreds at a time because to get the dynamics and the impact from them. Beautiful little plants. We also have fall blooming crocus that can be planted in the fall. Fall blooming crocus are much larger blooming. They stand up about this tall, where our spring blooming crocus is barely above the grass line. The fall blooming crocus are huge. The bulbs are huge. The little corms of our spring blooming crocus are very small, around about the size of a dime or a quarter, somewhere in there, or a nickel, whereas our fall blooming crocus are about the size of a large daffodil bulb or bigger. So they're totally different, but they do look a lot alike. The petals are very crepe papery-like. They're very delicate, wonderful. And just a bit of background. You ever heard of saffron? Saffron are crocus stamens. No, crocus pistils. Pistils. Yeah, on the stigma. Your stigma style, yeah, on the pistil, yeah. Yeah, the very ends of them. And they grow them in Spain, so there are fields and fields of crocuses. And all they harvest out of them is the pistil, the stigma, right out of the center of the flower. That's saffron. Okay, now let's talk about scillas. I've mentioned them. They're sometimes called Siberian squill. Scillas are beautiful plants naturalized, but they do jump out of the bed, go wherever they want to go, because they self-seed, and those little plants grow, and they flower within a year or two. And you'll have them just about everywhere. But the nice thing about them is if you don't want them growing somewhere, you can easily pull them out. The foliage dies down, you don't even see them. So if they come up around some of your other perennials, it's not that big of an issue because you can pull them out. They have these blue flowers. In the spring, under shrubs, it looks like a sea of blue. And I've got some examples of that when we talk about naturalizing. They're easy to plant. You plant them in lots of 50 to 100 to 300 because they don't get planted very deep. You can just take your trowel, pull it out, drop one in, next one. Or if you've got good loose soil, you can practically push them in the ground because they don't go very deep. Windflowers or anemones, always see these for sale. You don't see many blooming. I always wondered about that. If they always offer them for sale, why don't you ever see any in gardens? Well, because they bloom a little bit later, they're a little more sporadic, and they're not quite as showy unless you have them in a big splash like this. And they look good in the package, they look good there, but you get them home, and the tuber that they come from, it's not really a tuber, it's not really a bulb. I don't quite know exactly what it is, but it's all shriveled up. And the gardener, not knowing what they're doing, may just plant it out like that and expect it to grow. With the windflower, it's a good idea to soak those before you plant them, to give them a little moisture before you plant them. So I think that's how people fail with them. But they're very pretty. They have a very daisy-like flower in the pastel colors. I don't believe they come in yellow, but the blues, the purples, the whites. A very early little ground cover flower called Snowdrops, or Galanthus. Snowdrops have these beautiful little white petals with accents of green. Bloom very, very early in the spring. Again, you have to have a lot of them planted in an area before they really show and are dynamic. But they're fun little plants to grow, and they come back year after year faithfully, and they do spread. This is Crown Imperial. That's not a very good picture of it, but Crown Imperial is a Fritillaria. Fritillaria imperialis, and it does look sort of like it's got a crown on top of the foliage, on top of the flower spike. It's a beautiful plant, marginally hardy. I would say zone 5 to zone 6 is about what you're going to get from it unless you mulch well. Rabbits do like it, deer like it, but I've seen some beautiful plantings of it that come back reliably year after year. Colors, red and yellow. My favorite bulb, I think, in the garden is the allium. The allium is an onion. It's a member of the onion family, but everybody that sees it asks, what is that in your garden? Because it does not bloom with the tulips, it does not bloom with the daffodils, it blooms with the iris in late May. This particular one is called Globemaster, and I'm not exaggerating when I say it's this big around. And even with our spring breezes and winds, it comes up on a stem that's about this big in diameter and hollow, and that purple globe just seems to be suspended out there at about 4 foot high. It first comes up in the spring with our daffodils and tulips as big strap-like foliage, very much resembling an amaryllis foliage, big and broad. And about the time that it's blooming, the foliage is starting to fade, which is good and bad. Good in the sense that it doesn't linger like the daffodils, but bad in the sense that you sure hope you have something else coming up in front of it to cover its ugly foliage. That's why it and iris do make such a good combination together, because the iris foliage is sort of covering up the Globemaster bulb, the bad, ugly foliage. The bulbs on these giant alliums are as big around as a large Vidalia onion. Huge, huge bulbs. Very easy to plant. They go in about 6 to 8 inches deep. They're wonderful plants to grow. They make excellent long-lasting cut flowers too, but the problem is you may not want to cut them out of your garden because they look so beautiful. There's some other little alliums that you can grow, and I've got them listed there for you. Let me see. Christophe, Allium Christophe is one that has a head about this big around, that each little flower on that flower head looks like a purple star. It's also called Star of Persia. So if you ever have a chance to get these, it's got extremely broad foliage, but the plant only gets about this tall. It mixes really well in with hostas, because just as the hostas are about half grown, these are blooming with these huge, huge purple blooms. Come back faithfully and reliably every year. So highlight that one, the Christophe, called Star of Persia, because it's a dandy, in the front of a border or among your hostas. And then when it dries, it looks like brown stars out there. Some people use it for dried arrangements later. They just let it dry down. Now the giant allium, when it's through producing, the flowers fade, you can cut that off. You know what they look like? Exactly, they're faded flower heads. Couche balls. Remember those balls our kids used to have with the little rubber ends on it, the little spiky star things? They look exactly like couche balls. And they dry down completely, make beautiful dried arrangements. This is one that I have a terrible time pronouncing, but this is the third one I have listed on your handout, called Allium sphaerocephalum. It's one that blooms later than the giant alliums. The stems are much thinner. The heads are sort of a purple egg, you might say, and they sort of bob in the wind. So it looks like these purple eggs are just out there on nothing. When you're going to look for bulbs, it's really important that you select good quality bulbs. The largest bulb you can find is going to be the healthier bulb. So if they sell, we sell number 2s or medium size, go for the big ones, because they're going to give you the best bloom. Make sure you buy those that are free of any blemishes, because sometimes they get damaged when they're dug, they get damaged in transit, or they may acquire a disease while they've been in storage. Garbage in, garbage out is what we say. You plant bad, you're not going to get a good item from that. So make sure you make your investment worthwhile. Select only good, top quality bulbs. And I have ordered bulbs from many mail order catalogs and have had extremely good luck. But then you have to think ahead. Oftentimes I wanted to plant tulips, so you have to run down to the department store or garden center and get them. And there's nothing wrong with that, but your selection is better through mail order. I did have a handout on the back table, some of you may have picked up, on sources. It's a 1996 handout, so it's a little older, but the sources there are still good. Also, I gave you a bulletin, a handout on peony sources that you can find various nurseries, some very unusual nurseries that specialize in peonies. Those are the ones you're going to find, the fernleaf peonies, the tree peonies, a good assortment of the Japanese hybrids. So on that list. I don't list many websites, but some of those companies do have websites now too. Okay, so back to ordering bulbs. Make sure that if you order them mail order, that they ship them at your appropriate time. Most of them do. Some of them ship them at their will, so they'll ship them too early or oftentimes way late for your area. So make sure they say we ship, between the months of. When is too late? Well, I've planted bulbs on Christmas Eve in a very mild year, and they've come up. But that was one of those very mild years. As a general rule, probably if you don't have them in by the middle of November, you're going to be in trouble because the ground is going to start to freeze. The object of putting bulbs in the garden in the fall is because you want them to grow their root system in the fall, and they need that cold temperature to set their buds for the next year. So you need the root development and you need bud development. The depth that you plant the bulbs depends on the diameter of that bulb. We typically say 2 to 3 times the diameter of the bulb is the depth at which you plant them. Now, if you figure the bulb's going to be out this big across, you can plant it about that deep, 2 to 3 inches deep, as a rule of thumb. Our early season items, such as our jonquils, our species tulips, miniature daffodils, crocus, windflowers, they tend to be planted a little bit shallower because their bulbs are a little bit smaller. And as we go into our May blooming species, notice the depth is getting a little deeper. Daffodils, 6 to 8 inches. Grape hyacinths, about 4. Fosturiana tulips, 6, 7 inches. And our hyacinths, 4 to 6. Our fritillarias, big, huge bulbs. They go about 4 to 6 inches deep for them. And then the Darwins. When it comes to planting tulips and daffodils, select a site that's well drained. Select a site that you'll be able to view and enjoy those daffodils and tulips. Here's one along a naturalized path. The tulips, you say, well, they're not going to grow well because the foliage will come out and shade those daffodils and tulips so they don't get the nutrients they need. No, these are blooming early enough that they still get enough dappled foliage, dappled light through that foliage of the trees that they're still going to do well. The major problem will be is digging those beds with all those tree roots present. That's going to be the conflict. It's not going to be the light later on. And besides, many of these are just used as annuals anyway because they don't come back very well year after year. When planting tulips, I like to apply what I call the KISS principle. Has anybody ever heard of the KISS principle? Keep it simple, stupid. Pretty easy to remember. Keep it simple. The simpler is the more dynamic. And you'll see in these real large beds like at Kuchenhof, they have hundreds of bulbs of the same color. Now they may have drifts of several colors, but they don't have mixed. They're not mixed. They don't have red and yellow all in. Imagine if this beautiful planting would be red and yellow all scrambled. The impact would be gone because visually it's a confusing look. But by planting it like this, very simple, beautiful design, just 2 colors, it's a very high impact. And then of course you always select your favorite colors when you're putting in a bed, and I will not discuss that any further today. But when we talk about good color selection, keep it simple, go with complementary colors or colors that do very well together and that are showy. At Reiman Gardens, our first year when we received a gift for tulips, an individual as a memorial gave $5,000 for us to just put into tulips at the gardens. And so they planted these beautiful pink tulips. Well, when we were standing beside them, they were beautiful, but when you looked at them from the road, you couldn't hardly see them. So now they go with bright reds and yellows and other colors that are very dynamic that say, look at me. When planting bulbs, there are a couple things to remember. You want to plant, how are we doing for time? Pretty good. We want to plant so that we have clumps and clusters. Never soldiers in a row. Here in Iowa, we're so in tune to planting everything in rows, aren't we? Haven't you noticed that? Even at our country club, they plant all their plants all in rows. They're annuals. Instead of planting in clumps and clusters, everything is these big, nice rows. Never plant tulips as soldiers in a row. Plant them in clumps of 5 to 10 to 15 in individual clumps. They can be naturalized well. This is a scillas naturalized under a tree with the daffodils in the background, and that complementary color is just stunning. Under bushes, this is up by the President's House at Iowa State. It's just a sea of blue in the spring. My favorite combination is using miniature daffodils and hyacinths, grape hyacinths in the same planting. Wonderful. And this is the little miniature tete-a-tete. That's T-E-T-E, T-E-T-E, tete-a-tete. Some call it teet-a-teet. Wonderful little itty-bitty daffodil. Comes back reliably. Same height as the Muscari, grape hyacinths. Perfect combination together. Here's Tom Thumb, another miniature but much larger trumpet with the little scilla planted below it. Again, plant in clumps or drifts. Excavate the whole area. It's so much easier than using your bulb planter. I see those bulb planters for sale. I was sold with it one. I thought, oh, I got to have one of those. They are awful to use because the soil is either too dry, so when you punch in the hole, you twist it. Oh, this is nice. You pull it out, and there goes your soil right back in the hole. Or the ground is so hard or wet that when you pull it up, you get the whole plug of soil. Then it doesn't go back in the hole very good because it's a muddy mess. And you got to do that with every bulb. So if you're planting 50 or 60, that's a lot of wrist action. Now, I've seen the drill bits on your drills that you can use. That's a pretty neat thing, too. But I find the best way is to actually excavate an area. But that ensures you got the right depth. It also ensures that all the plants are the same, because if you plant it too shallow, those come up earlier and bloom before. If you want a uniform bloom, you plant them all at the same depth. What this also enables us to do is overplant or layer your bulbs. That's how I got the effect with the grape hyacinths and the miniature daffodils. You layer them. So on the bottom, 8-inch deep, so you've excavated your hole. I want this 3-foot hole, 3-foot around area in my garden, or around some of my perennials. I dig this area. Plant on the bottom your daffodils, because they go about 8 inches deep. Just cover those so you see the tips of the bulbs. Then go in between each one with tulips. Then fill that in, and you can go with your Scilla or Muscari on top. So what I did with the miniatures and the Muscari, I dug my hole 4 to 6 inches deep, laid my little miniature tulip bulbs there, or miniature daffodil bulbs about 4 inches apart, and then covered that, and then just put in as many Muscari as I could fit right there. And that's how you get that beautiful look. It's called layering or overlaying. It's just a simple procedure. And I've even done this in containers where you have it. You're going to overwinter your container in your garage. Huge pot that you usually put maybe your ornamental grass in, or a large planting. In the fall, when you empty that out, plant your bulbs. Daffodils on the bottom, tulips. You can go with crocus and scillas and Dutch iris. Pack that so full. But make sure you've got a clearance about this much on the top of that container. Don't fill it clear to the end. Any ideas why? I live and learn. The plants, the bulbs start forming roots. Those roots fill the area. The next layer fills the area. And pretty soon everything is heaved to the top. And before you know it, it's heaved itself out because of all the roots by the spring. It is a wonderful combination. And then you have more of a continuous bloom through the season in the same limited area. Naturalizing is easy, and this is the way I planted. I had 1 basket of Muscari bulbs, the little purple ones on the left, and 1 basket of the miniature daffodils, and it went in very, very quickly. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on forcing blooms. My time's about up, but I did put an extension handout on the back table called Forcing Bulbs, Spring Falling Bulbs into Bloom, something like that. And it talks about the easy process. You need a well-drained potting soil. You need enough bulbs to fill the pot, because you want to crowd them together. You don't use the same spacing. You just put them so long as they don't touch. And cover the soil so that just the tips are showing. So it's a little different principle than when you're outdoors. Then you water it well and you label it so you know when you planted those, because you're going to put it in a location that gets 34 to 40 degree temperature. Keep the soil moist. So if you have a refrigerator in the garage you don't use much in the wintertime, it's a good place for it. But just don't put these where you store your apples. The apples will give off ethylene, and the ethylene will prevent the buds from opening. So you don't want to put them with apples or any kinds of fruits that give off ethylene. Then you wait 13 weeks. So on that label, you put the date you put them in, but you can also count ahead 13 to 14 weeks to know when you should take those out. Because if you're a real avid gardener that forces bulbs, you will stagger them. So you'll plant them in 2-week intervals so that you can be taking them out at different times. When the shoots are about 2 to 3 inches tall, that's a good indicator that you can take them out. Now I have a problem. I don't have a problem, but my family sometimes have a problem with dirt in the refrigerator. It just doesn't seem to work very well. So I've gone to using hyacinth jars for things. It's a special jar that you buy at the garden center. It's an hourglass shape, but a nice hyacinth bulb fits just perfect right in the top. You fill the bottom part of that bell with water, and you put that in the back corner of your refrigerator, and you just leave it there. and you wait. And eventually those beautiful white roots come out of the hyacinth and into the water in nice straight shoots, just like the one picture on the right. Beautiful. And your hyacinth will bloom. And you can tell when it's ready to bloom because you'll get this yellow foliage in the refrigerator that's about 2 or 3 inches tall. You just take it out and put it in a sunny window. Very easy to grow and care for when you don't have the soil. Now I've seen this done with daffodils too, large daffodils, but hyacinths really look beautiful like this. Once a bulb's been forced, you can't reforce it again. I have mentioned Reiman Gardens a few times. That's my home. I work at Reiman Gardens. It's a beautiful place. I put a handout on the back table, and when we talk tulips, we're going to be putting tulips in 12,000 tulips this fall. Again, we did receive another gift from the individual as a memorial, and we'll be planting in drifts like this. Massive color of tulips around our campanile garden. So if you get over in the spring, give us a call and say, how are the tulips coming? And we can tell you, this year they were spectacular. We treat them as annuals. They come out every year and they're out because we then put annuals on top of that. Another reason is we have ground squirrel problems. And ground squirrels, if the rabbits aren't chewing the tops off, the ground squirrels are coming in and digging up they dig them up when they're in full bloom, pull them out of the ground, eat the bulb, leave the tulip. And I bet we lost a couple, 200-300 bulbs that way this year. We had very fat little ground squirrels running around. Our Reiman Gardens are 14 acres. We're open year-round now because we have a Christina Reiman butterfly flight house that opened last November. If you've never been there, this is home to 800 to 1,000 native and tropical butterflies. At any one time, we have about 1,000 in flight, 50 to 70 different kinds. So you'll see all kinds of beautiful butterflies over there. We are open every day. I'd come every day except Mondays. The flight house are closed. So we have a website. You can check on that, and I guess I have a handout in the back. So we're going to take a break and come back for questions. We'll give a chance to gather up questions.
Someone gave me the question. My newest bulb discovery is Comasia.
Gamasia. And the botanical, you see it in the color, is Q-U-A-M. And you see it written out as the English is C-A-M-A. C-A-M-A-S-S-I-A. It's gorgeous.
Comasia. What kind is it?
It's a bulb. It comes up late spring. And I was hoping you'd tell me. Because it's hardy to this area. So far it's been coming up reliably. And I just don't know if I'm lucky enough to put it in the right place or if it would do well everywhere. It is lovely.
Now you say with tree peonies?
It happens to come out about the same time as the tree peony.
Oh, but not necessarily planted with.
Well, I
Go
have
ahead. You know what I'm talking about. I'm quiet. Go ahead.
I'm not familiar. Actually, my mic on. I'm not familiar with that one.
native to the Pacific Northwest, but it's hardy to the zone.
I'm not familiar with that one. But you also asked about foxtail lilies. Foxtail lilies, Arameus, is a wonderful bulb. I didn't mention it. Comes in yellows and oranges and reds. It does look like spike with a foxtail, and that's more of a summer blooming plant than a spring blooming plant. But it doesn't multiply. You got to plant it in big clumps. 1, 2, 3 isn't enough. You've got to put it in a good sized clump. No, try it. They're wonderful. But the other one, I don't know. I'm going to go back and look for that. Where did you find it?
Catalogs.
Okay. You're one of those gamblers, huh? You like to try new things. That's okay. It's what gardening's all about.
You know, you can read the question.
I can read that. I didn't cut off my peony seeds heads. Should I do it now or wait until I cut the back the foliage? You can wait now. Go ahead and wait. Take it all off at one time. That's a good question because sometimes you leave it on. You think, oh, I didn't take it off. Should I take it off now? It's too late. Don't worry about it. Take it off this fall.
Does sprinkling tulip bulbs with talcum powder discourage ground squirrels?
No. No, it makes a mess. As far as discouraging rabbits and ground squirrels from around your bed, with ground squirrels will dig up the bulbs too. And the thing to do is if you have a serious problem, and this is major effort, take some chicken wire, make yourself a little basket, put your bulbs in, dig your hole, put it in the soil. But then you've got that wire in years to come. I have found what works pretty well, an organic, not organic, but a readily available product is mothballs. I did a little trial at our old gardens years ago in which I used commercially available products for rabbit control, Thiram, rabbit scat, stay out of my garden, and I used mothballs. And you know, the mothballs around the garden worked as well as anything. The only caution I have is if you have small children around there, you know, you don't know if you want those little attractive little white balls around, but they work pretty darn well. Also, what works occasionally for deer control is smelly soap. The really fragrant soaps like Irish Spring, and drill a little hole, cut the bar in half, drill a little hole through each half, and then just hang it in your garden. And I've tried that, and it's worked pretty well, because I have deer eat my tulips annually. They think I'm putting out a real smorgasbord for them every year. But the Irish Spring does do a good job, but you got to put it right in with your plants. Don't hang it on a fence nearby. It's got to be on a little stake right in amongst your plants.
Do tulips reseed?
The only ones that I know that really reseed would be the species tulips and the botanicals, species particularly like the tarta. And I let those go to seed. They put a nice little brown seed head, and they don't linger. It just flops over, and it self-seeds. Beautiful little plant for self-seeding. But other than that, none of the hybrids do.
What kind of tulips do you get from the ads of 50 for $5?
You get that mix, kind of what's falling on the floor, and they sweep up. It depends on where you buy them from, too. I would avoid those, mostly because they're mixes, and they're not, you may not get all the same type. It's a variety of things. You sort of get what you pay for. So if you're looking for something that's a quick fix right now, 1 year, try it. But if you're looking for something longer term or for a real showy display, I would avoid those.
Allium and rabbits, question mark?
Rabbits, leave them alone because they are a member of the onion family. They taste like an onion. The foliage is like an onion. You break the stem open to cut it like a cut flower, you can tell immediately they're an onion. So rabbits, leave those alone really well. They don't eat the bulbs either. You have a question back there?
Deer don't like allium.
No, deers will leave them. Yeah.
My hyacinths come back each year, but the flower heads dwindle in size. What do you recommend for fertilizing hyacinths?
Bone meal or complete analysis right after they bloom. But bone meal works really, really well.
What's complete analysis?
Such a simple, like a 5-10-5, 10-10-10, sprinkled around right after they bloom, because that's when they're going to be taking up those nutrients. It's when they're blooming, it's too late. It doesn't affect the bulb at all because they're getting all their nutrients for that bloom out of what they built up last year. So by fertilizing the bulb, you're going to be increasing your bloom next year.
My grape hyacinths produce foliage each fall. Is this okay?
Yeah, they do. They bloom. They send up their foliage in the fall. Rabbits may nibble on a little bit. It gets burned in the winter, inevitably. It's going to get yellow, brown, and they'll send up a little bit of new stuff the next year, and it blooms beautifully right through that old leaves.
Can I move my Globemaster bulbs this fall? They are crowding out a shrub, or being crowded by a shrub.
Yes, you can. Just so you know where it's at, and that's the key factors. If you still have a little bit of the stump left from when you cut it off, you can go ahead and dig it this fall and move it, because it should be fully dormant now.
Please comment on wood hyacinths. No, wood hyacinths.
Wood hyacinths. What do they look like?
Wood hyacinths look like a little bell. They come on a couple weeks after all your other bulbs are blooming. They come in pink and white and blue.
They're not woodland phlox. They are called hyacinths.
They're hyacinths, but they're bell shaped.
Are they a Muscari? I don't know. I don't know what the Latin name of that would be. Are they a Muscari, a type of Muscari? Oh, harebell? They're more of a wildflower. And I don't know about the bulbs or their underground reproductive system to think that you could dig them like you would a bulb. I think they travel some other ways. Do they? The wood hyacinths? The harebells?
Well,
Any other?
oh, you have?
By bulbs, not rhizome. Okay. You got me there. I don't know.
Okay, my daffodil greenery came up but did not flower. Do I dig them up now and see if I should separate them, or should I just put lots of bone meal on the area without digging them up? The beds are about 3 to 4 years old.
Oh, they shouldn't need dividing at all. It's a fertility thing, or it could have been the fact, fertilizer thing. Or it could have been the fact that maybe they didn't get enough light, or you cut them back too much or too early the year before. So it may take a year or two for them to finally get enough energy to bloom again. But I would definitely fertilize it, and I think it'd make a big difference. But now it's too late, right after they bloom, or right when they're putting on their foliage next year. That's the time to fertilize.
Can tulips do well in containers on my deck where deer can't get to them?
Do you have can you chain off your porch? Because deer will find them there. Yes.
It's a high deck.
Oh, they will do beautifully, but you got to put them in a location that doesn't freeze in the winter. I've tried the window well trick where then you put leaves in. They still freeze.
So bring them into the
Garage and put them against the heated wall, or I've even put them in an old styrofoam cooler in the garage, and they do beautifully. But you got to make sure you water it occasionally and check it. But it's one of those cheap old coolers. Works great. Insulates it just enough around the pot.
I think that's the only way I'm going to ever get tulips, because I live on Round Deer Road.
Right.
Lots of deer.
Lots of deer. But don't plant them like you were forcing bulbs, like at 35 to 40. Plant them 4 to 6 inches deep, like you were planting them outdoors. And then do that layering thing. I think you'll be real happy with that.
You suggested planting Allium Star of Persia with hosta. Does this cultivar tolerate sun? Or tolerate shade, excuse me?
Yes, it does,
Tolerate
because
shade.
it'll grow and it'll send up its foliage first, just when your hostas are coming up. And then the foliage dies down. And then it blooms, and then the foliage doesn't get anything when the tree leaves are covered up. So it actually makes a real good partner.
How can you be sure the stems of flowers are strong enough to bear the flowers upright on the plant?
Does that say peonies? Okay.
Oh, she's talking about peonies when she
Okay.
mentions this.
You know, someone once asked me, of all the breeding that horticulturists and botanists do, why can't they breed a peony that has a strong stem? You ever notice that? Even all the hybrids, all the beautiful new peonies, herbaceous peonies, there's not much a whole thing you can do. The main thing is to keep your plant healthy. Grow it in sun and then stake it, because there is no, I can't say there's a good variety. You get the bigger the bloom, the skinnier the stem, I swear. But no, there isn't one that has a real strong stem.
Does hot midday sun cause peony flowers and large peony leaves to wilt or burn? If so, how does one accommodate the required 6 hours of sun?
The herbaceous peonies will be fine in full sun. Now, it's a good question, because tree peonies do better if they have afternoon shade. So if you can get your 6 hours of sun between 8 o'clock and 2 o'clock in the afternoon, then the tree peony is in the shade in the afternoon. Your flowers are going to last longer, and they're going to be more vibrant, because they've got such delicate petals that are almost tissue paper-like that the hot sun will fry them.
You didn't mention the daffodils and multiple flowering heads, with multiple flowering heads per stem. They are my favorite. Liberty, Thalia. Are these ones?
They're good ones. What they do is they send up one stem, but they have multiple blooms on each stem. They're a little smaller, but they're beautiful, and they give you more bang for the buck. So if you have 5 bulbs, all of a sudden you have 30 blooms on it. No, they are good. And I didn't mention it, I get oversight, but they are wonderful. You get multiple flowering tulips too, but I don't think they're as beautiful as the multi-flowering daffodils.
All right.
Good questions.
Those were good. I think we're about there. Oh, I have one. I had a Fritillaria that was bloomed beautifully behind Bleeding Heart, and they were great together. But the Bleeding Heart the next year was so big, I think it shaded out the Fritillaria. Is that the reason that the Fritillaria didn't bloom that year and then didn't ever come back again? Or
It could have
you
been, but
think?
you never know what might have come along. Or did it bloom just one year?
Yeah.
Didn't come back the second
Came
year?
back the second year behind that bleeding heart, but it was like trying to find some sun, and it was
That was
really
it. And probably got overcrowded, too much shade on the foliage, not enough energy built up.
so
It fizzled
just
out.
couldn't make it. But if it had had sun, it probably would have been okay. Okay.
Because Fritillaria is a little different because it will come up and it'll be like a little bit like a tulip, but it needs all that sun and it lingers a long time. It needs a lot of sun when the foliage is really there for it to build up its food reserves. Good.
Well, I can't thank you enough. This has really been fun.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, everybody,
Thanks for
for
coming.
coming.